Can we do? The hour of 4 o'clock having long come and gone. We have a subletter from Speaker Madigan replacing permanent member Ling with temporary member Kalish. Clerk, please take the roll.
Zaleski. Evans. Sosnowski. Bennett. Carroll. Kifowit. Martwick. McDermott. McSweeney. Reich. Rita. Turner. Welch. Wheeler. Kalish.
13 having answer roll. Quorum is present. We'd like to acknowledge Minority Leader Durkin, who's joined us today. We're going to put Representative, where's Marcus? Representative Bob Rita is going to go in the chair. We're going to do one small item, but then we'll go to the amendment. Representative Rita, do I have leave to present for Representative Andrade, Senate Bill 1669?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Leave to present from my chair.
You may proceed.
We have House Floor Amendment number 1 to Senate Bill 1669. It's 2 scratch-offs, one for education, one for Alzheimer's research. It's a 2-year sunset. Or is it a 2-year or 1-year sunset? 1-year sunset. We're going to see the effect of this on the lottery's ability to manage these scratch-offs and go from there. I'd ask for its adoption.
Add Reich to the roll. Any questions? To our chairman, seeing none. Representative Welch recommends be adopted for amendment number 1 to Senate Bill 1669. Leave being granted of a vote of.
Wait, was there? Hold on. Okay.
Recommend be adopted. 14 voting yes, no one voting no, no one voting present. This measure will be reported to the House floor. We'll put Zaleski back in the chair. Hey, Cujo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Floor Amendment number 1 recommends be adopted to Senate Bill 69. Senate Bill 1669 will be favorably reported to the floor. Okay, we're going to move on to Senate Joint Resolution Constitutional Amendment number 1. Representative Martwick is going to present from the table. We'd ask the governor's office to join him. Our intent, it's the intent of the chair to have 3 panels. The first panel will be the sponsor along with the governor's office. The second panel will be proponents of the resolution. Third panel will be opponents. If you wish to be heard and you haven't let staff know, I would advise you to do that. You can let either one of these individuals up here know that you wish to testify, and we'll make you available for testimony. With that, Representative Martwick on Senate Joint Resolution Constitutional Amendment number 1. Is Leader Durkin, do we have leave to waive the reading of the witness slips? Okay. All right, we're going to let you know how many there were, Leader. We can start in the meantime. Go ahead, Representative Martwick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, Leader Durkin. Today I present for your consideration Senate Joint Resolution Constitutional Amendment 1, which amends the Illinois Constitution to eliminate the requirement that a tax on income be at a non-graduated or flat rate upon the approval of the constitutional amendment by Illinois voters. If approved, the constitutional amendment would allow the General Assembly to implement an income tax with a graduated rate structure, a fair tax. This is the gist of it. By voting today to move this bill to the floor, what we are doing in this committee, I say we as I am a member of this committee, is giving an opportunity for the body as a whole to vote to allow this to appear in the November 2020 general election ballot. We as legislators cannot impose a fair tax. We as legislators cannot take any action that would impose a fair tax. Only the voters of the state of Illinois could do that. And today, I present this Senate Joint Resolution Constitutional Amendment so that we can give the voters of the state of Illinois an opportunity to decide if a fair tax is in the best interest of all of Illinois. That is the gist of it. There has been much talk about this. I obviously have members here from the governor's office who are here to answer questions about the bill, but I will tell you that this is an initiative that has been worked on for many years by many people, and I am happy to say that this is one of the, if not the most important initiative of our new governor. What this gives us in Illinois an opportunity to do is solve our financial problems, eliminate our structural deficits so we can stop accumulating debts, and do it in a manner that gives relief to the people that are suffering the most under our tax system, the middle class, the working class, and the poor. As the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy has indicated, Illinois has the 8th most unfair, regressive tax system in the country. We put too much of a burden on those who cannot afford to pay, and by constantly accumulating debt year after year after year, we necessitate the need for higher and higher taxes, making that situation on those people worse year after year after year. It's time to stop that madness. It's time to restructure our tax system and put ourselves on a path to fiscal stability and responsibility. And I believe, and I'm asking you to join me in approving this so that the voters can weigh in, because I believe that the fair tax is the best way forward for our state. As I mentioned, I'm happy to answer any questions, and the governor's office is here as well. I ask for an aye vote.
Add Vice Chairperson Evans. We're going to allow Cameron and Emily to speak, and then we're going to go to questions.
Good afternoon, good evening at this point. Thank you so much for allowing us an opportunity to speak. This is one of the governor's top, if not his top priority. And the governor believes that people who make minimum wage should not pay the same rate as he does. He has said that time and time again. He believes in a fair tax where people who make less pay a lower rate and people who make more pay a higher rate. As the representative said, all we are discussing today is whether to give voters the opportunity to vote on the 2020 ballot in November, whether or not they want a fair tax structure for Illinois. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
And Emily, did you identify yourself for the record?
Oh, I'm Emily Miller. I'm Senior Policy Advisor in the Governor's Office.
Thank you. You're good? Okay. All right. Leader Durkin and Spokesperson Sazowski, we have 2,049 proponents, 6,428 opponents, and there are 30 people in the state of Illinois who really don't care about the fair tax in this state. So take that for what it's worth. We're going to start with Leader Durkin, followed by Representative McSweeney for
Well, Mike,
questions.
I think the referendum has already been tabulated and calculated, and you've lost. So thank you. I think the committee's already over. Appreciate it. All right. This is to, I'll ask Ms. Miller. Do you have the 71 votes right now in the House of Representatives to pass this?
I believe that is up to the members, not to the governor's office.
Sure it is. You guys have been working very hard on this.
Yes, sir.
And I'd like to know, can you tell me where your roll call is?
That's something for your body to know, and we're working very hard to
In the
make
interests
sure.
of transparency, which I know the governor is very fond of, I'd like to know where your roll call is.
Again, sir, that's your chamber, and we would not presume to be inside the heads of every member, but we have been working very hard and feel very good about where we are.
I have one more question for you, then I'm going to go over to Representative Martwick. The idea is to have this referendum placed on the November 2020 ballot, correct?
Correct.
What is the deadline for the legislature to pass this constitutional amendment out of both chambers before it can make it to that 2020?
It's 180 days.
Pardon me?
180 days.
What is, just tell me what that is. So the question I have is, why do we have to get this done in the next 2 weeks? Are we stuck against a deadline if we don't pass this by the end of the month?
We want to make sure that we have a plan to put Illinois back on track. We have a deficit that the governor's been very clear that spending needs to match up. We need to have a balanced budget, and we need that moving forward. And
The question I have, I'm sorry, the question I have is, when is the latest that the legislature can pass this constitutional amendment for it to qualify for the November 2020 ballot?
so that's 180 days
From?
from the date of the election.
I'm a simple person. Could you tell me where we're talking? We got till sometime next year, correct?
Correct, sir.
All right,
Yeah.
so there's really the rush to get this done. There's no urgency to get this done in the next 2 weeks, correct?
Go ahead.
Cameron Mock from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. The intent behind getting this done in conjunction with the constitutional amendment, which is before you today, is for the utmost transparency for the voters and what is being considered. And so the longer we feel that the voters have to know and digest, and this is a highly complex. Taxes are never easy, and so we feel the longer that we can have the rates out and that it's passed and voters know exactly what they're voting on, the better informed they will be and better informed to decide for themselves.
Thank you for.
I also want to add, sir, that this is something that we've talked about for years. This isn't a new concept under the dome. This is something that we've had conversations about in the past, and that members here have been discussing for a very long time. So this isn't something sudden that we're bringing at the last minute.
No, but it's never gotten this far, so we've never had to deal with it in this type of situation before.
Yes,
And
sir.
this is a huge policy decision that the legislature is being asked to undertake. So I'll ask, again, thank you very much, sir, you mentioned that in the interest of transparency, that we want to get this passed within the next 2 weeks, and then we can deal with the rates. Do you have any idea where your roll call is on this?
I'm certainly not the person to attempt to count votes. What I can tell you is that with my knowledge of the plan and the kind of the fair tax calculator thing we've put out there, we're doing our best to inform members of what's being considered. So we're hoping, we're optimistic
Sure.
that.
Don't you think it would be wise to pass a bill that will establish the rates before you actually pass the constitutional amendment out of the Revenue Committee?
I believe that's for the legislature to decide what order you'd like to hear these bills. So
Well, I'm sure that there's a lot of people who have slipped in opinion one way or the other, and I think they'd like to see some clarity on this, and this is of interest to many people, and I think that it would be wise before this committee votes on this that the public who are watching have an understanding of what the tax rates will be from the House of Representatives, because right now the governor has I think, indicated that he wanted a certain tax rate a few months back. I met with him. We discussed it. The Senate took a different approach, I believe. So let me ask this. Do you expect a different tax rate to be passed by the House of Representatives than what the Senate has passed?
I can't possibly know that. I do know the governor has said that he fully intends this to be a negotiation with both chambers. So his proposal is what he feels is
Representative
best, so.
Martwick, could you maybe add to that? Could you give me any idea of whether or not the House plans to undertake the rates that were passed from the state Senate?
Well, Leader, I appreciate the question. I am not the sponsor of that legislation. I think the governor has said from the very beginning, and I think the process has shown that he is willing to address the concerns and the needs of the members to make sure that the rates fit. And so, I think that's a work in progress. And so we'll see when the rates bill is introduced in the House where it sits. But I think it will be either way. I think it will be substantially similar to everything we've seen. It won't be a dramatic departure. It's my guess.
But again, it would have to go back to the Senate, and we're talking about 14 legislative days or so to undertake a change in the rates to pass the constitutional amendment. I think you're asking for a lot in a very short amount of time, particularly when the biggest issue that we have right now is our budget. We've got a few weeks left to be able to pass a budget. We would like to be part of the budget discussion. Not sure whether we will be, but we have a plan which we think can eliminate this whole need for the constitutional amendment, which we stated last week. I see some heads that are going up, some are going sideways, but there's real numbers out there that I think we can avoid having this tax calamity, which would be imposed upon Illinois citizens, which some people have estimated close to $3 billion would be raised, when we do have a pathway based on the Illinois Department of Revenue and also the Governor's Office of Budget and Management that states that our revenue projections are actually quite sound, in which we will have no need to raise taxes, no reason to change the Constitution. I hope that you take that into consideration. I just have 2 more questions. Now, how does and I'm going to leave this for anyone here. My biggest issue on this, I understand it's easy to beat up the rich guys, and I've heard the governor say that. Let's tax the rich. We've often talked about the small businessman, the sole proprietorships, the LLCs, and the subchapter S corporations. Are they treated differently under this Constitution than an individual filer?
No, pursuant to current state law, I would continue that if you're filing as a pass-through entity LLC, they would be treated under this fair income tax structure. What you should note, though, is that as far as business filings go, when you look at business filings, you have in excess of 95% of business filings that are actually at or below the 250,000 threshold. And when you look at individuals filing with partnerships in various businesses, and you look at them, over 90% of individuals who are filing with partnerships with businesses that file as pass-throughs, LLCs, et cetera, would see a tax break under this plan. So we feel that not only is it fair for them, but actually the vast majority, well over 90% of small businesses will actually see some relief under this plan.
I'm looking at a document from the IRS that says that there are approximately 71,000 of these small businesses that earn anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000. There's 22,000 of $500,000 to $1 million, and another 15,000 that are $1 million plus. It doesn't mean that this money goes into the pockets of the men and women who own and run those businesses, correct?
I'd have to know what data you're looking at, but what I'm referring to is net taxable income. We've run that data from the Department of Revenue and then butted against IRS, and we've determined that in fact, over 90% of those folks would see a tax break.
Right, but the 10% we don't care about, right? Is that what you were saying? We don't care about the 10% or the ones that are going to be actually affected by this because their pass-through income will pass the threshold of $250,000. But you know what? Who cares? Even though it doesn't go into their pocket. That's what you're saying.
Leader, if we can, we love having you here and we appreciate your passion, but if we can allow witnesses to answer the questions and try to maintain just a little bit more of a deliberative process, that would be much appreciated, if you don't mind, sir. Thank you.
Do you care about that 10%?
Of course we care about the 10%.
Then why are we saying that we're just going to let the 90%, you're saying the 10% are going to pay at this higher rate, even though that we know that this money that comes in is not money going into their pockets?
So the first point to make and to remind everyone what we're talking about today is the opportunity for voters to choose for themselves whether or not they even want the scenario that Cameron's describing. Whether 97% of people getting a tax cut, paying the same or less, whether that's something that people want in Illinois. That's what we're talking about, is giving them that opportunity. The rates bill, as you mentioned, is not, the sponsor of that bill isn't at this table. And
I have one last statement. There was a statement that said that Illinois is the most unfair tax burden upon all Illinoisans. It's not the income tax. It is the property taxes in Illinois is what makes Illinois' tax burden the most unfriendliest, the most unkindest, and the most unfair, and we're not doing anything with that. To me, that's a disappointment. There's no property tax relief that is on the horizon. And We just can't say that the income taxes in Illinois, which are certain across the board right now, are is what's hurting our economy and hurting Illinois families. Because where I live, it's property taxes. Where my friends downstate live, it's property taxes. And yes, my friends on the other side of the aisle who are in the city of Chicago and elsewhere, it's property taxes. So let's not say that this is the panacea for all property tax, all the tax problems we have in Illinois, because it really isn't. It comes down to taxing bodies. We've got more taxing bodies. Look at our tax bills and our property taxes. So I think I've said enough on this, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your allowance.
Representative McSweeney, followed by Representative Reich.
Chairman Martwick, we've had a friendly, long-standing debate on this issue of taxes, and I certainly respect you. But what is the plan? There's no doubt, no matter what the ultimate rates are, that this would be a pretty massive tax increase. What is the plan around resolving pensions and the spending side? And we've had this discussion many times, you know, as the chairman. Why aren't we talking today about a constitutional amendment to address pensions like Arizona has done and to address issues on the spending side? Why is this all only about revenue today? That's my first question.
Well, I believe, Representative McSweeney, that would require the filing of a separate constitutional amendment, which, of course, I don't know if one has been filed, but it's not a bill that I'm proposing, and it's not a bill that I believe in. So we can, well, while you ideologically may differ from the idea of a fair tax, I don't believe ideologically that we should balance our budgets by taking away pension benefits from middle-income public sector employees. So it's not a bill that I would be pursuing, nor would I be supporting it.
So as we talk about the rates going forward, and it sounds like we're not going to be voting on those before May 31st, sometime in the future, would you commit that once those rates are voted on, that you would never change those again for the foreseeable future? I mean, the concern, and obviously I'm well known as an opponent of this tax increase for a long time, but would you commit that you would never change those rates, that those rates would be locked in? You won't lock them in, I understand, in this constitutional amendment, but would you guarantee the people of the state of Illinois that you would never change those rates again for the for at least the foreseeable future?
Well, Representative McSweeney, certainly I understand your concern, and I think it's a legitimate concern, and I want to say this. Many of these proposals have been proposed in the past, and most of them were a couple of pages long. It was a constitutional amendment. Change the rates, and then trust me, the governor has made it more difficult for this process to move forward because he wants to give transparency to the voters about what exactly they're buying. And I give him all the credit in the world for wanting to put the rates on the table, even though they don't have to be decided on before the constitutional amendment, and even though, as you know, we cannot bind the hand of future legislators. So I could tell you that I would guarantee that I would not vote for a change in the rates, but Representative McSweeney, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here. And I cannot bind the hands of my successor any more than you can bind the hands of yours.
And that's my concern, is that we don't have the rates that are going to be voted on by May 31st. It doesn't sound like we're going to have the rates for a long time, and it sounds like we'd have more tax increases in the future. That's why I'm voting no. Thank you.
Appreciate that. If I could, you know, one of the things that I would note is that since the income tax was instituted in the state of Illinois, there have been a sum of 7 changes to that rate, and 2 of them, technically 3 of them, amount to decreases over prior rates.
Thank you, Representative Martwick. And a word about the rates bill. I am the sponsor of the rates bill, so I feel bad that Cameron, Rob, and Emily are taking the heat. We are very much working through the rates bill conversation. And to your point, Leader Durkin, we are very much acutely aware of the need for property tax relief. There's abundant pressure on this caucus to deliver property tax relief, and we're doing our best to solve for that. So I'm happy to answer any questions in any format on the rates bill, when either in private or when that bill comes before the committee. But I thought I should get these guys off the hook. Representative Reich, followed by Spokesperson Sosnowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What's the current flat income tax rate for individuals in Illinois?
4.95%.
Very good. Has anybody at the Department of Revenue or Gombe done any kind, well, first of all, what's the anticipated revenue impact of your so-called tax, progressive tax, if it's passed and the rates, either the governor's or the Senate's or whatever else we come up with?
So as the rates have been in flux, it's hard for me to commit to that, but my understanding is that the governor's proposal was 3.4, and I believe that the Senate's proposal was slightly higher than that, around 3.5, a little bit more.
Billion
Yes,
per year.
yes.
Has anybody at Gombe or COGFA or any of the other agencies that do these things, have they done any kind of an analysis of how much we would have to raise the current flat rate in order to obtain a similar revenue impact?
So I believe that the governor's office has done this, but in anticipation of the bill that I filed last General Assembly, I asked COGFA to do a study for me, and I asked them to assume that we would make every pension payment, which I think most of us agree we should make our pension payments. I asked them to assume that we would commit to our much heralded bipartisan efforts to reform the way that we fund schools and increase funding for those schools, P through 12 schools. And I asked them to assume that all other state spending would grow at its 20-year historical average, which, given the cuts we've had because of our financial crisis, is actually pretty flat compared to other states. And they told me that the rate that we would need, a flat rate, to balance our budgets over by 2045, so we make every payment on our pension schedule, was a 6.5% flat.
So what you're saying is 1.55%, if my math is correct, would have to be the increase in the flat rate in order for us to have a similar revenue impact to what you're proposing under the graduated income tax. Is that correct?
I don't know if that would equate on a year-by-year basis, but this was the number that I said if we were to eliminate our structural deficits over the course between now and 2045, the rate that they gave me was 6.5%. That's a COGFA study.
So you're saying that raising the progressive rate to 7 point whatever it's going to be at the high end with minimal relief to lower and middle class taxpayers is better than a 1.55% increase in the flat rate that affects everyone. Is that what you're saying?
I believe that it is representative because for many of the reasons that we've talked about here, there are people that are suffering under the burden of taxation in Illinois, and those people are the middle class, working class, and poor. They are also the people that are disproportionately suffering under high property taxes. And by putting our financial house in order and making sure that we are not continuously accumulating debts like we have over the course of the last 40 years, then we stop that upward pressure on taxes. We give them some relief, we start to address our problems, we put our state on a path to prosperity.
But without going to a constitutional amendment, we could provide relief at the lower and middle class taxpayers by providing additional exemptions, credits, earned income tax, expansion of the earned income. There are any number of opportunities to provide middle and low income tax relief without going to an open-ended system that would basically put the fox in charge of the hen house when it comes to dealing with things like rates and brackets. And what happens if inflation takes off? What happens if inflation takes off and people inflate their way into higher tax brackets? I've been doing this for 30-some years at the federal level, and I've seen that happen. So instead of doing something like this that can't even go into effect until 2022, why don't we do some substantive relief, maybe an increase in the rate, flat rate, with additional exemptions at the low end in order to provide the kind of relief that you're saying these lower and middle income people deserve, which I believe they do. I don't see the mad rush, the need for lack of a better term, we're dealing with class warfare here to a great extent as well. If this has been sold as somebody else is going to pay the tab, you're not going to pay this. I'd like to see something, and you mentioned regressivity in the tax system. How can a flat tax be regressive? How can, if I pay 10% on a $50,000 a year income of $5,000, let's say 10%, just for math purposes, and somebody making $1 million at 10% paying $100,000 in taxes, how is that regressive?
So you forgive me, Representative, you asked a lot of questions. I'm going to try and get to all of them, so I only say that to remind me if I miss one, okay? So a flat tax is not regressive. What is regressive is our entire system of taxation. For years, we have accumulated debt in our pension systems and in other areas because we were not willing, although we had the tools at our disposal, to balance our budgets. Instead, we accumulated debt, and that has put this upward pressure on taxes, and it continues to do so. And instead of raising our flat tax, we have pushed the responsibility onto property taxes, and we've pushed the responsibility onto fees and sales taxes and many other regressive taxes that we have, so that our system as a whole is regressive. This is a way of addressing that regressivity and making the system more fair for the people that need some relief. It's a very important point. You say, why don't we just do it? Those tools have been at our disposal since the inception of the flat tax, and we have not done it because there is constantly pushback against it. This is an effort to reform the structure so that we have the tools at our disposal and we can put this into effect and make our system more fair.
You and I have had many conversations over the past couple of years about the system of our pension problems, and you and I both understand the extent of them, and I don't think that either one of us, I think we're both honest people about the extent of that problem. We've had very good conversations. What is, under the Edgar ramp, what is the 2045 is when we're supposed to be at 90% funded based upon what we know now, right?
That is correct, yes.
Do you know how much we are supposed to be putting into the pension plan in 2045 in order to attain that last payment?
I believe under the current schedule, our payment would be approximately $19 billion.
$19 billion on a, how have you done any kind of estimation of what general revenue would be in 2045?
I've asked for that study. It would, I think, be approximately 28.5% of our revenues.
28.5% of our revenues.
Yes, under our current revenue structure, yes.
Has the governor committed any of this money that is going into the, if he gets his progressive tax, has the governor committed any money toward front-loading the pension obligation in order to alleviate that ramp?
He did. As part of his initial proposal, he indicated that he would be adding revenues from the fair tax. The original proposal was an additional $200 million, and I believe that number would grow with inflation. Is that right? Now, again, I would point out that that's the governor's proposal. Ultimately, it will be up to the legislature to make those decisions in terms of spending.
$200 million is not enough to cover the increase in the pension payments from one year to the next. You know that.
That is correct.
So basically speaking, this progressive income tax is not going to solve the systemic problems we have, such as our pension debt and our unpaid bills. Where is this money going to go? What is this money going to be used for?
Well, it is going to be used to pay down our backlog of bills, to make sure that we make our pension payments, because under the current flat tax, it is quite clear, and let me point this out, the other half of the equation that I asked of COGFA was not what should our flat tax be, but if we don't raise the flat tax to the 6.5 that they say we need, how far would we fall short of our ability to pay our bills?
Yeah.
And they said the accumulated debt would be $224 billion of additional debt. So this allows us to begin to solve that. Actually, it solves our year-to-year, year-after-year structural deficit, and allows us to begin front-loading payments on our debt, on our pension debt, and that will relieve those out years so that they can be more affordable.
28.
Clarify.
Go
the
ahead. I'm
governor's
sorry.
Proposal was 200 million on top of the required growth and contribution. So it'd be 200 on top of the statutorily required ramp.
Would that 200 million then extend the ramp? Would it, or does that include an extension of the ramp? Does it reduce the amount of time that it takes for the ramp to get us to 90%? Or does it, and how much then does it reduce the payments going forward?
Yeah, the proposal on the 200 in isolation, not, the governor announced with the additional revenues realized that he's indicated he's not pushing the re-amortizing in any way. But the 200 million, it's simple math, is just time value at roughly 7% discount rate annually over the remaining life of the ramp. So basically, you're getting time value interest on the 200 million annually. So it's helping to basically make the curve of the ramp slightly less.
Slightly less,
steep.
okay. But until we came across $1.5 billion in April that I think you can pretty much anticipate April is a pretty good month for state revenues. It has been historically. We had $1.5 billion. The governor's original budget indicated an $800 million funding shortfall to the pensions this year. It seems to me that we have a governor who the first place he runs when he doesn't have enough money is the pension plans. So how do we know that the $200 million that he's committing to this plan will in fact materialize and be put into the pension plans along with our normal contributions that we're supposed to be making?
So Representative, I really appreciate this dialogue, and Cameron could talk about this all day. But the measure that we're talking about is just whether voters get to decide on the November 2020 ballot whether they want a fair tax.
But the thing of it is that these are the questions that have to be answered before we can even vote on that question, because if we don't dig deeply into what is going to happen when this passes, we've lost any opportunity we have to put that genie back in the bottle. So we need to ask those questions. We need answers to those questions. We just cannot say, oh, this is a great idea, let the people decide. The people need to know that we've done our job to determine whether or not this is actually going to work before we go and put it on a ballot. And I have not heard any kind of answer that says that this, as opposed to other type of tax reforms that we could do and without the necessity of going to the Constitution, that we could do. So I appreciate you trying to narrow the focus of this conversation down to just the issue of whether it will be on the ballot or not. But until these background questions are answered, I cannot give you any kind of consideration toward this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sosnowski, and then we'll go to the next panel. You have a question, Tom? Okay. Representative Sosnowski, followed by Representative Bennett.
Just a couple quick follow-up questions, just for clarification. I appreciate you coming from the governor's office to talk with us today. So on the question of preference, I understand it's not part of this legislation, but there was a plan introduced for rates. There was a secondary one in the Senate. Does the governor have a preference on when the rate structure would be passed? Obviously, the legislature has to decide and vote on it, send it to them, but what's the preference?
The governor feels very strongly that the people should know what it is that they're voting for. So when they go to the polling place in November, they know what they are, the structure that they are voting to put in place. So he feels strongly that we need to be transparent and have something that's ready to go into effect.
Okay, so the preference is just prior to the general election then, to have that rate structure?
Preference is to be honest with voters and transparent with them the entire time. So that's why the governor, throughout before he became governor, discussed wanting to work with the legislature on that. He proposed his own idea, and the legislature has been talking that through for the last several months. The Senate had their idea. I'm sure your chamber will have your idea. And
Okay. Representative, if I may, I think the answer to the question that you're looking for is that the governor would prefer that these are done together, simultaneously. So we're voting on the amendment and the rates at the same time. I think that's his preference. That's what you're asking, right?
Yeah, the answer I got, though, was prior
But the legislature is voting at the same time,
but-
yes.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you put words into the governor's mouth, but I'll go off of your statement, which is fine. Second follow-up question. In regards to so you touched on this with the previous question with the constitutional amendment, and so I just want to focus exactly on that language, because the prior question, talked about kind of setting, some restrictions. So why was there not a restriction set into the actual constitutional language that said a certain portion would go toward pensions, whether it be a percentage or a dollar amount? Why was that not considered in this proposal, for governor or for the legislator?
So I don't believe that was, I don't believe that spending is something that is emblazoned in the Constitution anywhere, a certain percentage. The constitutional language that we're dealing with is simply the language that relates, the legal language that relates to the structure that our income tax can have. I don't believe that it would be appropriate, I could be wrong, I'm not a constitutional scholar representative, but I don't believe it would be appropriate to designate a certain portion of taxes to be for pension payment. I think that is a matter for the legislature to decide.
Let me just, one follow-up. You're correct, it's nowhere else in the Constitution, but it can be written out in a constitutional amendment that says a percentage of this new tax can go towards pension reduction or to pensions in general. It can be. Was that ever considered?
Not in the amendment. The amendment was strictly limited to the language as it relates to the structure of the tax.
One last quick question. Just because this is more of in the overarching budget discussion, so I understand it's not 100% germane to this question, but it's definitely related. And some of the dialogue with some of the questioning talked about regressive and non-regressive taxes, and you stated that this is not a regressive tax, and we can debate that, but there's another proposal out there from both the Senate and from the governor's office that taxes gasoline, which many would argue is very regressive. How do you kind of differentiate between the two of those? We're going to increase a non-regressive tax, but on the other hand, there's a lot of proposals to increase regressive taxes. Don't those two philosophies contradict each other?
I don't believe so. I think, you look at each situation individually. This is specifically limited to the income tax, and it's one way of beginning to balance the scales for our entire system. There are many taxes that are taxed on a flat or per use basis. This is one instance where we have the ability to tax based on an ability to pay scale, and that can help balance out those other things. So I think it's all a part of the whole recipe of how we tax the people of the state of Illinois in order to provide them the services that they need and demand.
In your opinion, is a gas tax regressive?
I really hadn't thought about it. I mean, it's based on, there are so many different factors that go into it, and so I'd have to give a little bit more look into it. It's not a straight sales tax because it's affected by mileage and use and whether or not you have access to public transportation. So I don't know. I really couldn't opine on that at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Bennett, followed by Representative Wheeler, and then we're going to go to the next panel.
Thank you very much, Representative and Chairman. Thank you very much for all your efforts. I know trying to put the entire budget together from the governor's perspective has taken a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of time, putting things together and redoing them again over and over to get to the point where the governor is satisfied and as well as his staff. What I understand is the governor basically explained that it was about a $1.2 billion hole in the budget that he had put forward. Is that in the ballpark? Is that what I understand? That's my recollection, please.
Yeah, we started out, so fiscal year 20, we were looking at about a $3.2 billion deficit. I think the idea was identifying what's structural versus what's some of the one-time issues. And so you have some level of structural deficit, in excess of $1 billion, but the whole, at least for 20, was about $3 billion.
$3 billion. Okay, so where did the 1.2 come from then?
I believe that's in reference to kind of the structural piece of, again, we had like in 19 it was artificially low as far as the spend side, you know, you had the owed steps, and then you had some assumed revenues that didn't come to fruition in 19, things that made, suppress the base and made 20 look higher. So you kind of have to look through the year-to-year volatility and determine what is a structural basis, even though each given year's deficit may differ from that. I believe that was the kind of the structural piece baked in.
Okay. So what I understand here recently, COGFA and others noted that we're expecting $1.4, $1.6 billion additional funds coming into the state coffers, which, as I understood it, was more than the 1.2 that the governor had talked about as far as the whole goes. I'm hoping we're taking a serious look at this, and it's hoping that you reevaluate where we are, and hopefully we're reevaluating what we really need to be doing, if we really need anything at all with any kind of tax increase. In fact, there's been several folks talking about we don't really need a tax increase if we have $1.4, $1.6 billion coming out here that we didn't expect, where we had a $1.2 billion hole in the governor's budget. And I think we need to really look at this before we go further. And again, I appreciate all the efforts. It's a wonderful problem to have, the 1.4, 1.6. I think it caught a lot of people perhaps off guard, but it was great news, and I really think we need to look at that seriously. So please, you're getting ready to go. I don't mean to slow you down. So jump right in. Go ahead.
Sure. The 1.4, I think, was in reference to fiscal year 19, so that helped. We were struggling to close the budget we inherited, and so 19 was imbalanced itself. So that was to help close the end of the year. Without further accruing a backlog. For 20, the revenues that we're looking at, I believe, are around $900 million, and it's about the amount of money that would have been saved by reamortizing the pension ramp. So as soon as you don't do that reamortization, that offsets the fiscal year 20 amount, so that you're basically, you're still at the same level. And, you know, to the point I think it was mentioned earlier about some plan to where you don't need increased revenues, I think I would take significant issue with the overstatement of certain revenues in that. Not only that, but when you're talking about the refund rate, other things like that, these are one-time revenues, and you're looking at trying to fix a structural deficit. So that proposal did not get us there, and certainly did not get us there on a reoccurring basis. So we have reassessed where we're at today. We took the pension reamortization off the schedule, understanding kind of some of the reservations around doing that. And I think the rating agencies really applauded the governor announcing that he wasn't going to seek that.
I agree.
And so,
Thank you. That was really
so
good.
that was kind of, I think, a win for a lot of folks. And so we've reassessed, and we've still looked at what the revenues are needed, and the $3.4 billion roughly out of the fair income taxes is still what we need to be able to close this gap and continue to reinvest.
Okay. I appreciate it. I hope we continue to look at this. But Reiner said the 1.4, 1.6, that hopefully will give us a chance to reevaluate this as we go forward. And then also, we've read some things about some different organizations where Illinois were ranked as 36th in the country. And if this goes through with number 48th in the country as far as our ability with taxes, et cetera, we really need to be aware of that. And impact how different agencies are really looking at what we're doing and looking at us very closely. Thank you, Chairman.
Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Martwick, the language I'm looking at here for this amendment still leaves intact a ratio between individual and corporate rates. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
So while leaving that there, we're changing it so that you can effectively apply rates at any rate on any measured income imposed by the state. Do we ever consider the idea of actually limiting what that cap could be, is how high that rate could go? I'm looking at it from the perspective of a taxpayer. If a taxpayer is seeing there's an income tax change being made, in this case it's to our Constitution, and there are no rates built into this constitutional amendment. Nothing says how high my tax rate could go as a taxpayer. And I'm trying to see how you could balance that if I'm a person who is saying, okay, I have to vote on this constitutional amendment in that election in 2020, but I don't know because there is no rate in the actual amendment itself. It's being left to the General Assembly. So what protections can we offer the taxpayer of Illinois who already feels like they're taxed pretty well? Is there something you can say that perhaps we could limit it to a certain amount. I think the governor's proposal was around 8%. The Senate matched something in that neighborhood.
So what I would say is, I have multiple parts, but the first thing I would say to that taxpayer is that this proposal will reduce the tax burden on over 97% of the tax filers in Illinois
Hold
and
on,
give
but-
anyone
but-
making...
But to the point, that's one set of rates that's being considered now.
Yes.
That's not something, when they vote on this constitutional amendment, they're opening the door to whatever that could be in the future.
So, and I apologize, Representative Wheeler, I have the utmost respect for you, and you know that, but I take exception to that this would open the door. This does not open any doors that are not currently open. There are no rate caps emblazoned in our constitutional language as it exists today, and this General Assembly has the freedom, with the votes and the signature of the governor, to raise the tax rates to whatever they want. And yet, the number of times that the taxes have been raised have been very few in number since 1970, when this tax rate when the flat tax went into effect. Very few times have they been raised, and the reason that they've been raised is because of what Representative Bennett said earlier about, well, let's not do it now because we don't have to. People have been afraid to actually address the problem head on, and instead they have chosen to allow us to accumulate debts, and that has ultimately put the upward pressure on our budgets. The pressure on our budgets has caused the upward pressure on taxes, and it has forced us to raise taxes in order to keep up with our debts. This puts a structure in place that eliminates that deficit and will eliminate that upward pressure.
And I'm going to rewind you back to the perspective of that taxpayer.
Yes.
They didn't create most of those problems. They didn't probably create any of those problems.
Probably very few
right.
people in this room are part of that.
And my point back to you, my friend, is that the income taxes have changed multiple times in the last 8 years. There's been 3 different changes. 2 of those are pretty big jumps. So the stability from the taxpayer's perspective right now is not great. We have been going up and down. And this is a perspective of saying, gee, do you want to go up some more? And the answer to that question by design is right now, yes. And my question to you is, as a colleague really is there something else we could consider within this framework that would limit the rate that they could ultimately get up to constitutionally, so as a backstop for the taxpayer, and at the same time, can we not include language? I think I've seen a resolution, or actually a CA from Representative McSweeney regarding a 3/5 majority to change those tax rates. That would also give a little bit further stability to rates for taxpayers going forward.
Well, the best protection that the taxpayers can have against future tax increases is balanced budgets. And that is something that this body has had a very difficult time over the course of the last 40 years doing. This gives them the tools to ensure that there are balanced budgets, that there is no more accumulated debt, and there is a lessening of that pressure to raise taxes. This body, as a political body, has been very, very, very wary to raise taxes. It has never been easy. It has been an enormous lift, and it won't be any easier under this structure. But more importantly, we will have the tools to ensure that that is not forced upon us by fiscal irresponsibility.
Well, I appreciate the answers to my questions. So the answer really is that we're not going to consider those things at the moment. I wish we would, because I think there's the protection of balance. If we're asking you to give us latitude to raise things for certain taxpayers, there should be a backstop for those taxpayers to be able to say, this is how far it's going to go before they have to answer the question on the ballot itself. With that, I'll say thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative. Thank you all. Stay nearby. We're going to bring on the panel of proponents. I'm told there is a concluded panel of proponents that wish to be heard on this. Mr. Lewitzki, welcome. And
hi, my name is Naya Kelly, and I am the State Legislative Director for the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless.
welcome to the Revenue and Finance Committee. Why don't you go first, and then Dave can follow up.
Awesome. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm here to testify in support of SJRC1. CCH is an advocacy organization that represents people experiencing housing insecurity and the providers who assist them with services. I know you all have all heard this time and time again, but the budget impasse really impacted our providers, and they've continued to struggle. In our sector, half of the homeless youth organizations reduced and/or eliminated services for youth. Examples of the types of programs closing include drop-in centers, youth health initiatives, single-family rehabilitation, transitional housing, adolescent substance abuse treatment, and case management. These services often provide youth with a home base. It's a place where they can manage their immediate needs like do laundry, get food, have a warm place to sleep. While there, youth can also access services and sit down with a case manager to learn more about permanent housing or enroll in a GED class, counseling, or job training. When we do not provide these services, we will see these youth again, whether it is in jails and prisons, mental health facilities, experiencing chronic homelessness in adulthood, or dead. We know that the programs cost money, but at the end of the day, they are cost-saving for the state. For instance, the Homeless Prevention Program is a 20-year-old program that assists people in remaining housed. Nearly 80% of Americans state that they live paycheck to paycheck. One emergency would put their housing in jeopardy. But the Homeless Prevention Program assists in keeping these people housed. 88% of the people who utilize the program remained housed after receiving services. It saves the state over $7,000 per individual in emergency services and shelter funding, per a study completed by the University of Notre Dame. In 2007, Illinois was able to prevent more than 14,178 households from becoming homeless and entering into the shelter system when the fund was funded at $11 million. As of FY19, the program was funded at $4.9 million, less than half of what it was in 2007, and Illinois prevented less than 4,000 households from entering into the shelter system. While the cost of living and housing has gone up, this line item has not kept up over the years with inflation and such. When we have budget hearings or talk to legislators about our specific budgetary needs, we are consistently asked, where will the money come from? What other program will we have to cut because of our budgetary ask? We understand that people are not just one issue, especially when people are experiencing poverty. Often when someone goes to a provider because of housing instability, they may also need medical assistance or childcare or job training. So today I offer the answer that SJRC A1 is the solution that would make sure that we can serve the whole person. And I have to answer the very cruel question of what other line item will we cut in order to meet one of an individual's needs, because the state is underfunding services across the board. Thank you for the opportunity. I urge a yes vote.
Thank you. Mr. Lewitsky.
Good evening, thank you. My name is Dave Lewitsky. I'm representing several organizations that are proponents of this constitutional amendment, including SEIU Healthcare, Shriver Center on Poverty Law, EverThrive, Heartland Alliance, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, Access Living, and the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. So I sit and hope to bring a general perspective of the budget issues we're looking at. I sit here today as someone who's been in this fight for years. I've had conversations with many of you and many in this building on a fair income tax structure since, God, I don't know, 2010. Over the last few years, we saw the state suffer without a budget, and social service agencies were forced to scale back or even close their doors. Yeah, part of that budget showdown was about politics, but the politics only was able to be created a problem that way because of our revenue problems. We saw supportive housing providers go over a year without getting paid. We saw child care eligibility slash, causing low-income working families to be forced to decide between working or taking care of their children. We saw numerous human service providers close. We saw cuts and lack of investment in the services that we all care about. Why? Because the state did not have the revenue to provide the basic services it's obligated to provide. A fair tax is the best way to put the state back on stable fiscal footing without asking those in the middle class and those striving to get there to pay more. The reality is the state has a broken revenue system. Our tax structure is out of line with almost every other state in the country. Our overall tax burden in the state is one of the most regressive tax structures in the country, and that was discussed a little bit earlier. But what does that mean? It means that because of our reliance on the flat income tax, along with high property and sales taxes, we have the fourth most regressive taxes in the country overall. In real numbers, this means that the bottom 20% of taxpayers pay over 14% of their income in taxes, while the top 1% only pays 7.4%. And frankly, even the flat income tax alone punishes the lower and middle classes and fails to adequately capture the extraordinary income growth we've seen at the very top of the income brackets. That's a broken system, and that's why I sit here on behalf of many organizations supporting this amendment. Under this amendment, we can finally start to change this regressive system and make sure that we can have higher rates for higher incomes and lower rates for lower incomes. We urge every legislator, all of you, to vote yes. To Leader Durkin's point on the roll call, we hope we have 118. So we want to give the voters a choice. It's all we're asking on this amendment is that the voters get to choose whether they want this. It's a decision to cut taxes for 90% of filers while raising more than $3 billion a year, or larger cuts across the board to services and programs we care about. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for proponents? Seeing none, thanks for making your voices heard today. Much appreciated. Opponents, if you'd like to come up and be heard. Why don't we start with Mr. Denzler, and then we'll go around the horn. How does that sound?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mark Denzler. I'm President and CEO of the Illinois Manufacturers Association. Today I'm here on behalf of 4,000 member companies and facilities that employ 592,000 men and women on factory floors that pay wages of $88,000 per year. Quite frankly, a fair tax is a tax that somebody else pays. I support a tax on haircuts, for example. But I'm here today because the Illinois manufacturing community is strongly opposed to a graduated income tax that will take billions of dollars out of the hands of hardworking residents and job creators. There's been a lot of talk about billionaires and millionaires, but let's talk about who this proposal really impacts. Small and medium-sized businesses across Illinois, manufacturers, retailers, family farmers, car dealers, beer distributors, nursing homes, and more. 75% of IMA members are small companies with less than 250 employees. 93% of Illinois manufacturers pay tax under the individual rate. If adopted by the General Assembly and ratified by the voters, Illinois will have the unholy trifecta. We'll have the second highest property tax rate in the country, the single highest sales tax rate in the country in Chicago, and now the third highest income tax rate in the United States. It's not exactly the message that job creators who are looking to invest their resources like to see. Contrary to what the advocates are likely to believe, the top corporate tax rate will actually be 10.49% based on the Senate proposal, and the highest individual rate would be 9.49% because you have to include the corporate personal property replacement tax, 2.5% on C Corps, 1.5% on small businesses. By the way, manufacturers in the business community will be asked to pay millions of dollars or billions of dollars in higher income taxes without getting the property tax relief. There's very limited property tax relief. Why is this an issue? And others have talked about it, but polls clearly show that Illinoisans don't trust politicians to be wise stewards of their tax dollars, and it does set the stage for potential bait and switch down the road. We would suggest there's a ratio in there of 8 to 5 for C Corps to small business individuals. There's no similar ratio based on the top and lowest individual rate so that all individual filers are tied together. Additionally, I can go on and on. There's other opponents here, but we're not even sure that this fixes the problem. We don't think it's the best way to address Illinois' budget problems. There's been no talk about cutting spending or reducing some of the cost drivers. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Andrew Nelms with the organization Americans for Prosperity, and I'm sure we can all agree that we must restore Illinois to its rightful place as the economic engine of the Midwest, but granting the legislature greater latitude to levy higher taxes is not the solution. Over 170 years ago, the Scottish economist John Ramsay McCullough said the moment you abandon the cardinal principle of exacting from all individuals the same proportion of their income, you are at sea without rudder or compass, and there is no amount of injustice and folly you may not commit. Now, despite our state's many troubles and woes, the Constitution's Article 9, Section 3 requirement that the income tax shall be at a non-graduated rate serves as practically the only bright spot on the Illinois tax horizon. Conversely, with a graduated income tax scheme comes the increased risk of volatility and complexity and decreased predictability. Now, you've heard from others, and you will hear from other opponents, about the ill effects that this would have on the state's business climate, but all taxpayers would face greater uncertainty as well, because it's likely that future legislatures would and potentially almost immediately begin to increase rates, add additional brackets, and reduce the thresholds at which higher rates apply. In fact, recent events have illustrated this concern. Since the governor's plan was unveiled in March, the number of people who have been promised a tax cut has gone down, and the number of people who would see a tax increase has gone up. And just to give you an idea of state income taxes by the numbers, 9 states have no state income tax, and additional 9 states have a flat tax, meaning that more than a third of all the states have either no state income tax or a flat one. And as you likely know, we forfeited the title of 5th most populous state to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so of the 5 states that are larger than us in population, 2 have no state income tax, and Pennsylvania has a flat tax. And the trend across the nation has been a shift away from progressive taxation. In 2011, Utah switched to a flat tax. In 2014, North Carolina followed suit. And just last year, our neighbor Kentucky did likewise. Twice in the last 5 years, Colorado voters have rejected ballot initiatives to adopt a graduated income tax there. In fact, the last state to adopt a graduated income tax was Connecticut in the 1990s. And in 2016, the Democrat governor of Connecticut stated, quote, "I've raised taxes multiple times, it's not working, and it's come up a cropper." Well, I had to look up what that meant, but apparently it's a colloquial phrase meaning a failure. Some would even believe that a graduated income tax is the silver bullet to solving our massive public pension debt and crippling property taxes, but a state worth mentioning as a cautionary tale would be New Jersey, as the state that our high property taxes are consistently second to. The Garden State's woes go back decades just like ours, and in 1966, in an effort to address their crippling property taxes, they implemented a sales tax. A decade later, still faced with high property taxes, they implemented a graduated income tax. Well, nearly half a century later, New Jersey still suffers under crippling property taxes, massive public pension debt, high outbound migration, and a top marginal state income tax rate of 10.75%. And as has been mentioned, and certainly will be mentioned again, the governor's proposal would give us the 2nd highest corporate income tax rate in the nation, the 4th highest top rate on pass-through entities, and it would give us one of the highest, lowest tax rates of any state with a graduated income tax. And so to Representative Sosnowski's point about the regressivity of our overall tax structure, it's because we have the highest cell phone tax in the nation, one of the highest state and local sales tax rates in the nation, high property taxes, of course, and now we're talking about doubling the gasoline tax. And so it's our position that this is not the direction that the state should take, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Orfe Divungi. I'm the chief economist at the Illinois Policy Institute, and we're opposed to a constitutional amendment to enact a progressive income tax. For a number of reasons, I've heard some of them today, actually. Representative Martwick talked about regressive taxes in the state of Illinois. That's our whole system that's regressive, he said. And we have a trust issue with the governor's office because on one hand, they want to get rid of some regressive taxes. On the other hand, they propose $40 billion plus in new regressive taxes. I think the voters have a right to know the truth. So there's a trust issue there, which is why we oppose the constitutional amendment that something like that goes to the ballot. I think we should stop saying that the progressive income tax will lead to property tax relief because it won't. We know the main cost drivers are our unfunded pension liability. As long as that grows faster than income growth in the state of Illinois, we'll have to raise taxes a lot. In fact, I did the math, right? We can defer on ideology, but the math is not subjective. You would have up to 84% in terms of tax hikes if you were to dedicate every single dollar of a progressive income tax to pay down the unfunded pension liability for at least 40 years. So this is not a plan that will result in middle income class tax cuts. It's actually going to raise middle income taxes over time. I think we should stop saying that it's going to be a middle class tax hike because it won't. More than 9,000 now Illinoisans slipped against this bill. We hear from taxpayers every day who don't want this progressive income tax because they know what it means for them and their future in the state of Illinois. The governor is telling people to make a decision based on a false premise. The administration says Illinois needs a progressive income tax because it will fix all of the state's problems. I've already highlighted that it won't fix the pension problem. It won't, if it doesn't fix that, it won't fix the bill backlog. And it definitely won't help those people who actually need those extra services, right? So we need more money going to education. We need, I heard from people representing the homeless community. As long as we have this big problem, we can actually have funds go to people who actually need the state. And that's a problem. A third major tax hike in a decade has been terrible for the state of Illinois, right? We could see unemployment rates continuing to hover above the rest of the nation. We could see income growth lag the rest of the country. And the General Assembly has done nothing to address Illinois' structural spending problems. Everyone agrees that the progressive income tax won't generate enough revenue to take care of the structural deficit, let alone pensions, which means it will result in middle-class tax hikes like I've highlighted. We've already seen a backdoor middle-class tax hikes through things like the gas tax and Netflix tax that are now being proposed. If all these tax hikes take effect, any marginal relief folks would actually see from a progressive income tax, even if it's temporary, will vanish completely. I feel the governor is very disconnected from middle-class realities, like going to the pump and not being able to fill up before the next paycheck. When he's throwing around these huge tax hikes and fee hikes. So what I'd like to know from the members of this committee is when the progressive income tax inevitably fails to generate enough revenue, then what? What will we do next? And that's all I have for you today. I'm happy to stick around for any questions.
Thank you very much for having me, Mr. Chairman. My name is Andrew Libman, president of the Libman Company in Arcola, Illinois. I'm one of the manufacturers that Mark was talking about here in the state of Illinois. We've been in business since 1896, family-owned business, fourth generation. We're in Chicago up until the 1930s, moved to Tuscola in the 1950s, and eventually down to Arcola. So we've been there for quite some time, really been committed to the state of Illinois, manufacturing in the United States. While other companies have moved to China over the past 20 years, my father told me we're going to stay in the United States, and it's worked out very well for us, actually. We employ about 600 to 700 employees. That's grown from about 150 in the mid-90s. About 80% of our employees are factory manufacturing type positions. 40% are female, 55% are Hispanic and minority type positions. About 60% of our labor hours fall in that $11 to $15 minimum wage bracket. So when that passed, certainly a concern for us. And then with the progressive income tax potentially coming on, I think we're obviously further concerned. I think that's why I've come today. We have a 1.4 million square foot facility. We've continually invested in Illinois. It's all centrally located in Illinois. We don't have manufacturing locations in other states. So we really count on the state of Illinois to provide all of our labor, and it has a major impact on our company. Also want to just, a small fact is we actually recycle 172 million water bottles every year for our broom fibers. So all of our broom fibers are made out of recycled water bottles. We buy crushed water bottle flakes and extrude the fibers. So a lot of environmental sustainability there as well. In addition to the minimum wage and the progressive income tax being proposed, we're also concerned about our lack of competitiveness in Illinois versus other states. I've never done any research on this before, except when this has come up in the past 60 days. Really learned a lot about Indiana, Wisconsin, Texas, and what some of the other states are doing to try to attract companies there. And Texas is one that certainly stands out. The population growth there, so much manufacturing is moving there as well. So. Certainly something we haven't paid attention to at all, but something we've kind of been forced to learn about. The type of jobs that we have, packers, assemblers, forklift drivers, material handlers, machine operators, People can come in at a starting wage, in that $11 to $15 bracket, but eventually they work their way up, with commitment to the company and a desire to be successful. We looked at the state of Texas, looked at their wage increases over the past 5 years to today, and applied that same percentage increase over the next 5 years, and they're still going to be significantly below $15 an hour, in the $13 an hour range. So that's a big difference, between the state of Illinois and Texas in terms of manufacturing. And this was mentioned earlier, but being an S Corp, the profits of our company filter down and show up on our individual tax returns, but that doesn't necessarily mean we take that money out of the business or we take that money home. We reinvest that money in the business through heavy investment machinery, equipment, buildings. So a higher tax is going to really limit us in terms of that continual investment to continue to grow the business and invest in our employees. A big reason we grew from 150 to 700 employees is because we continually reinvested in the business. So if manufacturers are willing to make that commitment to keep investing dollars, that's really how you grow the employee base, increase payroll taxes. The mindset should be really growth, not looking at a finite number of people and businesses here. We're going to take more from them, but how do we get more businesses here and more people here and grow the overall base? I think that's the answer to how we get out of the difficulties in the state. And I think that's a very business approach. In business, we can't stand still. Most businesses are either going forward or backwards or you're getting run over. So we always have to be proactive in thinking, how can we grow to get to the next level? And just to hit again on the competitiveness with other states, states are offering aggressive 10-year abatements on real estate taxes, 70 to 100%. Our real estate taxes are very high. Every time we put up a new building, whether it's a factory building, an office building, it adds to our real estate taxes. Other states are offering abatements on their personal property tax, so machinery, equipment, buildings. There's a lot of incentives out there to come to states and get into manufacturing. And manufacturing is highly desired. In my conversations with some other counties, they talked about manufacturing being more desirable than distribution because the wages are potentially higher there. So that was new to me, but something I was very pleased to hear being a manufacturer. There are a lot of other grants out there in other states, city, county, state. They're really trying to attract businesses to their states. And we're showing savings in the tens of millions of dollars in years 1 to 10 by moving to a state like Texas. And I'm just using that as an example. And then years 11 to 20, there's still a substantial savings, although not as much because there aren't as many incentives. I think the biggest thing for us as a manufacturer is the capital investment. The machinery, the equipment, the building. It's a highly capital-intensive business. You continually have to reinvest in that. So, looking forward down the road, I think tax credits that would apply to capital expenditures would be extremely helpful. A company that is making a capital investment is really making a statement that we're staying here. They're buying machinery, they're buying buildings, they're making a commitment to the state and grow the number of employees. There should really be incentives given to those types of companies to stay and help grow the overall Illinois tax base. Thank you very much, and free to answer any questions.
I'm going to start with a question, then we're going to go to Representative Reich, followed by Representative Sosnowski. We have a letter from Leader Durkin replacing permanent member McDermott with temporary member Calkins. You mentioned Kentucky recently in your remarks, correct? They have a flat rate, correct?
Yes, they do.
Didn't they just recently raise their rate, though?
I don't know if they've raised it since they switched.
We think they may have, and
I don't know that. I don't know the answer. I can certainly find that.
We think they may have, and we think that in the switching to the flat rate went higher than any of the graduated rates they had on. So it would seem to me that your preference would be to keep lower graduated rates than a higher flat rate. Wouldn't that make sense?
I guess we'd have to see how it averages out. That's the concern here. Obviously, even under the governor's proposal, he's not even suggesting that the 97% would pay less. Now it's 97% would pay the same or more. And so right out of the gate, we're already talking about people paying the same rather than less. And then, the concern is that that's only going to go one way, and that's north.
Yeah. Okay. Representative Reich, followed by Representative Sosnowski.
I want to discuss, Rob, the issue of, the concept of fair tax. You're calling it a fair tax. Got some statistics here. Using the governor's rates, let's not get into anybody else's conception of rates here. Let's just talk about the governor's proposed rates. According to our analysis, those who would be affected by the higher rates amount to filers of a little over 200,000 people in 2017, something like that. We've got 132,000 from 250 to 500,000. It's 200,000 people.
3% of 6 million.
I'm sorry, what?
3% of 6 million, is that about right?
Something like that. The governor's rates start at 4.75%, then go up to 4.90% for 10,000 to 100,000, and go to the current rate of 4.95% for people of 100,000 to $250,000. The average tax saving for people under $10,000 is $6.67, $37.75 for people between $10,000 and $100,000, and $64.46 for people making up to $250,000. $3,710,000 would be raised by people making $250,000 and more. And if you take that $3.7 billion and divide it by 200,000 people, on average, you're dealing with well over $100,000 per person. I guess what's fair about that? What's fair about giving somebody a $6.67 tax cut, telling them that their taxes are going to go down, and then pointing to somebody else and saying, this is going to be paid for by somebody else at a much higher income? What's fair? What's fair here? Define fair, please.
Well, what I would say is that when the alternative is somewhere between a 6 and a 6.5% flat tax, then I would say that this is a far more fair way of eliminating our structural deficit, because it gives some relief to those people who are suffering under the highest burden of taxation, which is the middle class, the working class, and the poor.
Okay.
So that's what it does. It adds fairness to our overall system of taxation.
It depends on whose ox is being gored. You're aware, you're a tax guy to some extent, to a great extent. You understand, you've heard of the minimum tax, right? At the federal level, the minimum tax, and then the alternative minimum tax?
Yes.
Back in 1969, the minimum tax was passed in order to provide that 155 families in the United States would pay more than zero income taxes, because these people were taking advantage of deductions and things like that. As of the year 2000, 5.2 million families were subject to the federal alternative minimum tax. That tells us the kind of political pressure that is put on people like us to sweep more people into the tax structure than had ever been dreamed of when this thing started. That's the concern I have with regard to this, and the disingenuousness of calling it fair. Because what happens is that as you move out into the future, inflation brought 5.2 million families into the alternative minimum tax by the year 2000. Inflation has not died, it's sleeping. You get a cop and a teacher or a principal at the high end of their tax of their income stream, they're well within that 133,000 people who are going to get hit by a 7.75%. And those are middle-class people. Those are not rich people. You've got 24,500 people who make $1 million or more in this country, in this state, and they're going to get nicked for $2.6 billion in that income tax. You know what those people are? They are mobile. And when they see that kind of tax bill coming down the pipe at them, along with, what happened? There was a guy in New Jersey last year who left the state, took up residence in Florida, and there was an immediate $200 million hit to the budget in the state of New Jersey. If guys like Ken Griffin and well, our friend Bruce Rauner leaving the state, those guys are going to make a big hole in whatever revenue estimates that you have whenever you start talking about relying upon people at the high end to whom the world is a place where they can live instead of Illinois.
Representative Reich, we'd
I'm
like
done.
you to keep the germaneness of your questions to the opponents, if you could.
Mark, gentlemen, do you have anything to say about that?
If I may, I'll just add something. There's no there's no relief from the governor's plan because we know how fast property taxes are rising in the state of Illinois, and they rise because of pension. You talk to municipal leaders, they'll all tell you that pension debt is the main cause of property tax increases in the state of Illinois. And as long as we don't address the pension problem, there will be no relief. The $6 tax cut you mentioned will be gone within a year because of an increase in property taxes.
Representative, Representative Spokesperson Sosnowski, followed by Representative Calkins, and then we're going to go to a vote. Oh, Wheeler, followed, then we're going to go to a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, and I guess maybe Mr. Denzler, Mr. Nelms, if you want to comment on the, just because of your organization's kind of, work within a national framework and competitiveness that was brought up by the gentleman with the manufacturing company. Certainly it is an important thing to point out. Just wanted to drill in on the rates real quick and the difference in the mobility of brackets, especially based off of some of the conversation about how inflation really does dramatically affect that. And even within this legislature, Speaker Madigan introduced a bill a couple of years ago for a millionaire's tax, and that was an additional 3% surcharge, which still would have been less than the brackets that have been introduced by the Senate or the governor. So that should give us pause. Representative Martwick, I believe you co-sponsored that. And so we look at that, 2 years certainly makes a difference. Now brackets, proposed anyways, are higher. We see in other states, and this is where I'm asking maybe these two gentlemen just a comment on what your constituent groups see, but my understanding is that there's been other progressive taxes in states around us where it started out, maybe a couple decades ago where it seemed higher, but wasn't accounted for inflation, and you've got, I've heard the number of $40,000 now is the top, considered the highest income rate, and that's the max tax bracket. And I think that's something we all have a concern about and how that would affect, but in particular maybe manufacturers and what you see in a state-to-state comparison. Could you give just maybe a little bit of comment on that?
Sure, Mark Denzler with the IMA, and I think you have to look at every state a little bit differently. But what I would say again is if this were to pass, Illinois would have the second highest property tax in the country, the single highest sales tax rate in the country in Chicago, and now the third highest income tax rate in the country. And we would actually become the second highest income tax rate in the country because Iowa is scheduled to roll back, I think, in 2021. So we would be number 1 or 2 in all 3 of those categories. And very briefly to Representative Reich's question, it does put, and COGFA said this along with the Civic Federation, the best tax systems are broad-based with low rates. And what happened in 2008 and 2009, when you start increasing taxes on a shrinking sector of the population, you provide great risk and uncertainty. And in 08, 09, when the recession hit, the income of the top wage earners or businesses making $500,000 or more dropped by 39%. The wages for the lower income dropped 8%. So if we hit a recession in a year or two and we have a graduated system, it is going to have a much more profound impact on the state and our revenue than would be the current flat system.
Representative Sosnowski, to your point about inflation, just to give you an idea, in 1985, the median household income of the state of Illinois was roughly $23,600. Applying inflation, that's $56,350 a day. In the year 2000, the state's median household income was just shy of $42,000. And again, applying inflation, that's over $62,600 today. And you mentioned Speaker Madigan's so-called millionaire's tax. Well, if you apply inflation in the reverse, $1 million today at the time of the adoption of the 1970 Constitution was the equivalent then of $150,100. Of course, to Mr. Denzler's point as well, whenever a tax system becomes more complex, the wealthy and the well-connected will find ways to rig it in their favor. Here in Illinois, we have a complex tax system in property taxes, and we see that happen. But at the federal level, we saw what a heavy lift it was to reform the federal tax code for the first time almost in my lifetime, because of the fact that the wealthy and the well-connected hire lobbyists to insert loopholes and carve-outs and exemptions, and the rest of us pay for those.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Wheeler. And then, okay, Representative Wheeler, followed by Representative Calkins, for Representative Bennett. We're going to ask that you do your best to be mindful of the robust debate we've had. So go ahead, Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. As a small business owner who came here to try and help more small business owners grow those jobs, we talk about it on a pretty much continual basis in this place. Can employers and people who represent employers, can you give me some impact? I hear this all the time about the idea that every time we go to Springfield, we talk about raising taxes, we do something else that's going to add to that uncertainty that then drives a wedge between investment and other strategies that they can make money with that don't necessarily ultimately create jobs in Illinois. Can you address how your members or how you are feeling directly about that element of this process?
Yeah, and Mark Denzer, we hear it all the time. I mean, I talked to Andrew, I think, last week about this very issue. I was this morning at an employer in Southern Illinois that employs 900 people that is considering moving out of the state. They cited workers' compensation, they cited tax policy and their increased costs. So again, every employer is a little bit different. They look at the totality. It may be tax costs, it may be work comp, they may be close to customers. They look at totality of different things. But certainly when they look at Illinois, there's been a lack of stability and predictability, and they certainly are concerned about what's coming down the road, and taxes are among the major concerns that they have.
Go ahead, and it's fine. I know you mentioned a little bit before, but.
Yeah, just some of the same points. I think for us, it's the total package of looking at the minimum wage issue, plus the progressive income tax coming. All these things just add up and really force you to look outside the state. But certainly something we don't want to move. But at a certain point, the scales start to tip in a certain way. We do have to consider it.
Thank you. And to the two gentlemen who, well, go ahead if you'd like to add something.
So one of the comments I hear often about this progressive income tax is, we want to do something about income inequality. There are 300,000 unemployed Illinoisans out there, people who are actually actively seeking employment. And we know that a progressive income tax hikes in general, actually slow job creation and hurt the wages of those entrepreneurs, employees, right? So they affect firm growth, so business growth. They affect how many people a small business can actually employ, and the wages of the people they employ. So that answers your question. And those are studies that are published in the economics academic literature, right, by people like Nobel Prize winner Edward Prescott, by people who worked for the Obama administration, Christina Romer, by people who worked for the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, Harvey Ross and Greg Mankiw, great macroeconomists who have come up with decades of research on this topic, and all found the same thing. Tax hikes hurt the economy, but most importantly, they hurt those who are seeking employment. We did our own study, and we looked at Connecticut. Connecticut was the last state to implement a progressive income tax. And in Connecticut, in the 90s, when the economy was booming, the U.S. economy was booming, poverty rates were falling across the country, poverty rates actually increased in the state of Connecticut. And 70% of that increase in poverty rates could be directly accounted for by the change to a progressive income tax in 1996. So that's my answer to your question.
Actually, you answered the next question as well. I was going to ask if there's any other data that shows how income inequality is affected in other states and their experience. So you're citing Connecticut. Are there others that someone can point to?
We can also say that income inequality is not lower in states with very progressive state income taxes. It's not necessarily a means to solving income inequality. Frankly, growing the economy and having more jobs and better paying jobs is a far more effective way to reduce income inequality.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
In fact, I'm going to add to that. If you're pricing out people from the labor market, you're actually increasing inequality. So this policy could be actually disastrous for the state of Illinois and for those people who actually need a leg up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Calkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Liebman, your company employs 600-700 people in the town of Arcola. How many people live in Arcola? How big is that town?
About 2,500.
About 2,500. And your payroll, roughly, an annual payroll or monthly payroll?
Between 20 and 30 million a year would be our payroll.
20 and $30 million a year payroll in a community that size. And your annual investment in your company, which is obviously after tax, you invest roughly how many millions of dollars a year?
Capital expenditures, which is machinery, equipment, buildings, would be in the $30 million range each year.
Each year?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So making Illinois less attractive to you and your family means taking 600 and some jobs out of our state, $20 million a year of investment, a huge payroll hit, property taxes roughly annually $1 million?
Yeah, 1.2.
$1.2 million
property taxes today.
out of a rural town in central Illinois. Yeah. Pretty dramatic. Thank you. To the sponsor, sir, do you believe that a progressive income tax will attract or keep businesses in Illinois?
I believe that the worst thing that we do for businesses in this state is the irresponsible manner in which we have run our finances. The accumulation of debt is constantly putting pressure on income taxes to raise. It is crowding out our ability to fund programs that is then pushed off to the local level, which winds up in high property taxes. And so I think that the most irresponsible thing that we can do for our economy over the long run is not solve our financial problems. Now, over the course of the last 4 years, we had a governor who proposed trying to lower our taxes through a series of what I would call nothing less than heartless and draconian cuts that the vast majority of people in your caucus didn't support. And yet he couldn't even get within $3 billion of proposing a balanced budget. It's time for us to acknowledge the math and decide what our path forward is. I don't believe that that path forward is a 6.5% flat tax. I believe that the path forward is through a fair tax, and I believe that when we do that, when we eliminate our structural deficit and we stop accumulating debt and we provide stability to the state, then that will begin to solve our problems so that, yes, it will make it better. So in the long run, Representative Caucus, in my heart, I believe that this is the best thing we can do for our business community.
I don't question your intent and your motives. I know that you're a champion for fiscal responsibility in this state. I guess I would feel better if 100% of this $3.4 billion would go to paying our back bills, would go to paying our pension plans, and not one dime would go to any new programming. That we could live within the $34, $36, $38 billion a year through the natural growth of our economy and that if you were going to propose that we had an income tax increase, that every bit of it would go to address the problems that you see, that we are here obviously trying to solve. But I don't hear that. I hear that we're going to spend that money on this program, that program. We're going to increase our spending on things that, you know, quite frankly, it's not going to solve our problem. It's not going to solve our pension problem by any means. And for that reason, you know, I find it extremely difficult to support this. And I just, you know, perhaps there's a better way. But this isn't something that I see as attracting, keeping businesses here, or solving our financial problems. But I thank you very much.
Representative Bennett to close with a question.
Yes, sir. It's more of a quick statement, not a question, but we'll be there. I understand I appreciate your patience, Mr. Chairman, I really do. My question was very similar to what Representative Keith Wheeler was asking in terms of the jobs, the impacts, the competitiveness around the states around us. And I think I'm not going to ask you to repeat those things, but we're not painting a pretty picture here. We're painting more of the same problems that the businesses have encountered in terms of struggling to be competitive within the state of Illinois. We have the states around us with their tax structures, with the taxes that we are having to pay, where the state should be trying to find ways to help support business to grow. That's the way we're going to get ourselves out of these issues, but instead we continue to pile things on top of the very businesses that we need to find new ways to support, and we're just not doing it. This is very similar to what happened to the minimum wage. We're hurting the very same people that we're trying, or at least we say that we're trying to help. So I won't repeat that. I do appreciate the time. I appreciate, gentlemen, you coming today and sharing your concerns. We need to hear this, and we need to hear it loud and clear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing no other questions for this panel, is there anyone in the room that hasn't been heard that wishes to be heard? Seeing none, Leader Turner moves do pass on SJRCA 1. Clerk, please take the roll.
Zaleski?
Yes.
Evans? Yes. Sosnowski? No. Bennett? No. Carroll?
I'd like to comment before my vote. I still have strong reservations on this. Representative Martwick, you and I have had conversations. I appreciate your forthcoming on this. But with that being said, I believe this is way too important of an issue of us not to bring to the floor, so you're going to have an aye vote for me now, but that does not necessarily mean you'll get my support on the floor.
Kifowit? Yes. Martwick?
Yes.
Sweeney? No. Reich? No. Rita? Yes. Turner? Yes. Welch? Yes. Wheeler? No. Kalish? Yes. Calkins? No.
On a vote of 9 voting yes, 6 voting no. SJR CA001 will be favorably reported to the House floor. Seeing no other business come before the
Mr.
revenue.
Chairman,
Yes,
just thank you to the members of the committee for a robust and respectful debate. Thank you, everyone. I
Thank you,
greatly
Representative.
appreciate it.
Congratulations. Seeing no other business come before the Revenue Finance Committee, the committee shall stand in recess to call the chair.